Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, welcome to you all once again to this beautiful place and beautiful city. Having a discussion on the commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance in Montenegro on the eve of our second membership anniversary in NATO is highly symbolic and very relevant. This year, 12 member states are celebrating anniversaries of their membership, and the Allies reconfirmed just last month in Washington our strong commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance, which marked its 70th birthday. We live in a complicated time. After the Berlin Wall fell down, some were speaking on the global triumph of liberalism, and even more on the end of history. Only 30 years after, international liberal order is under serious threat, if exists at all. It sometimes looks like democracy is in retreat, and this is an authoritarian heyday. Autocrats sometimes seem to understand each other better and cooperate more effectively than we do. In NATO, we often call it ever-changing security environment. It does put alliances' commitments to the test. Though I would argue that the commitment of the Allies is still unwavering and its cohesion proves to be solid in all recent events, nonetheless, there are both internal and external challenges that our alliance is facing from multiple directions. These challenges directly test the cohesion and commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance, which should seriously be taken into consideration. The history of NATO was filled with crises and questioning of allies' commitment to fight for the same cause in the past. The crises within the alliance were sometimes related to the differences of opinion on matters outside NATO. For example, Suez crisis in 1956, Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, or Iraq in 2003. And on other occasions with regard to the future of the alliance itself, for instance, when France left the integrated military structures in 1966. In the 1990s, we faced new security challenges in Europe, and NATO helped to end conflicts in the Western Balkans. After 9/11, Alliance took a lead in the international response in Afghanistan, so that the country does not become a safe haven for international terrorism and continues to create the conditions for peace. These tests of transatlantic trust were emerging with almost every single change of the security environment and the nature of threats. Yet, as a result, we witness NATO more solid and more united after each of these crises and challenges. The alliance has always demonstrated great potentials to adapt. It is one of the reasons why it remains the most successful political military alliance in history that strengthened Western prosperity and prevented new world wars. All these crises helped make NATO members realize that the existence of this security alliance is more important than mutual disagreements, specific interests, and differences in point of view, and proved what the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said: "The only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them." The burden-sharing debate is almost as old as the alliance itself, and will continue to be important as we need more investment in our defense, and we need to adapt to the ever-changing security environment in order to respond to the growing security challenges and risks. I would not agree that there are disputes over the need for the increased budget spending for NATO, but there are just different views on the way it should be achieved and what should be included. Fair burden sharing underpins everything allies do, and NATO is making major progress, including with 4 consecutive years of rising investment in defense of the allies. I would specifically like to draw attention to the Secretary General Stoltenberg's claim that there is no contradiction between EU efforts on defense and a strong NATO as long as it means not competing, not duplicating with NATO efforts, but complementing, as these EU efforts will strengthen the European pillar in NATO. End quote. The historical facts of the past wars and developments in the Balkans clearly indicate that Europe needs NATO and strongly depend on it to preserve peace and stability of the old continent. That's why we should advocate for more NATO-centric solutions that will ensure the advancements in European defense capabilities, but within NATO alliance and with no duplication. Defense spending is not just a matter of fair burden sharing. It is essentially a matter of the alliance's credibility and political unity. As NATO tackles 21st century challenges, a broad and diverse spectrum of different assets, skills, knowledge, and capabilities will arguably be the alliance's comparative advantage over its adversaries. Therefore, by delivering on Wales' commitment, we are also investing in our transatlantic unity, solidarity, and cohesion. Montenegro, still the newest ally, is at the moment on the 13th place in the rank of defense spending among 29 allies, and fully committed to achieving the Wales commitment by 2024. The cohesion of alliance has been challenged by fundamental changes in the international order, by the state and non-state actors and external factors as well. NATO today operates in the most complicated security environment in its history and is facing a more diverse spectrum of threats than ever before, emanating from the east as well as from the south. Russia's growing international assertiveness, its revisionist policy, marked by aggressive actions, is one of the most distinguished features on the time we live in. Russia, for the first time after World War II, annexed territory of the sovereign country that is UN, OSCE, and Council of Europe member, and de facto occupied territories of the other sovereign country that is also UN, OSCE, and Council of Europe member. Russia violated the agreement of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, and repeatedly demonstrated readiness to interfere elections and undermine democracies in America and Europe. This policy is something that doesn't seem to stop anytime soon. But fairly speaking, this has been, though then in different ideological packing, a constant that has characterized most of the time of very NATO existence. The alliance has to respond to this with the strengthening of its deterrence and defense, while maintaining periodic dialogue with Russia as appropriate. The dual-track approach has been effective so far in demonstrating and preserving allies' unity and cohesion, as it was shown in the cases after Salisbury attack and Russia's violation of the INF. However, having in mind the hybrid actions Russia is taking against the allies and partner countries, both the alliance and the individual allies will have to strengthen their resilience. Therefore, further strengthening of capacities is needed in different areas, covering better protection of critical infrastructure, safeguarding energy security, enhancing cybersecurity, and increasing media literacy and awareness of our societies. Having in mind that in the last decade, economic and political influence of China has grown significantly, more comprehensive and deeper cooperation with China poses certain challenges, especially with the growing opinion that the balance of challenges and opportunities presented by China has shifted. Therefore, continued communication with China is essential in order to reinforce political trust and safeguarding against potential serious security implications, especially in the area of foreign investments in critical assets, technologies, and infrastructure. Besides Russia and China, there are also non-state actors active in the transatlantic area. Violent extremist groupings and probably their actions will continue with the focus on MENA region, but also on the Euro-Atlantic area. Fragile states are vulnerable to extremism, militias and criminal groups, which pose a range of security challenges from terrorist attacks to humanitarian crises and uncontrolled migrations. There have been significant results achieved through joint efforts of the international community in fighting ISIS. However, while the military defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq marks a milestone in the campaign against the jihadists, they remain a threat, using guerrilla tactics and continuing their propaganda. In order to respond to the ongoing challenges, the alliance will have to preserve the cohesion within and to continue an open transatlantic dialogue. The different nature of geopolitical threats facing Europe and the United States will continue to challenge the unity of NATO, and we will have to balance the security interests of both southern and eastern member states. That is why we need firm and convincing commitment to strong NATO, ready to contribute to stability today and to adapt to future challenges. I will conclude by saying that NATO is and will continue to be highly relevant for us, its members, but also for the peace and security in the world. I strongly believe that even though our world is changing, some things will remain unchanged. our commitment to one another, which is giving us the strength to overcome our differences and rise to any challenge. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you after that dramatic voice. I always feel like God should be coming down to a place that looks a little like a nightclub, but it's a very pretty one, I have to say, but it's in the Balkan spirit. It's a great pleasure to be here. I haven't been to Montenegro since the Kosovo War and its aftermath, and I have to say the changes are remarkable, and I wish Montenegro all good fortune as it proceeds toward European standards on rule of law, transparency, corruption, etc. It's really important. It's a very important model for others, for larger countries. I have to say, it's fascinating and quite enjoyable to watch the changes. Enough nostalgia. It's not Yugo nostalgia. I am going to bring up my president, Donald Trump. We have in this panel, it's the ironclad commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance put to the test. And it was Donald Trump who, for a very long time, simply refused to commit to Article 5, which is exactly the ironclad commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance and the collective defense that all NATO members sign on to. He came to NATO's new headquarters with a speech that finally was supposed to say that he was committed to Article 5, but looking at the new NATO building, as a real estate guy, he apparently got angry. He didn't like the building. He thought it was too expensive, it had too much glass. He was in one of those Trump moods. So he didn't say what his staff told everyone he was supposed to say, which was he was committed to Article 5, which he finally did later. And I hope we believe him. The other wonderful thing he did was he raised the question of aggressive Montenegro, which I think is really quite amazing. Since we're here, he was worried that you aggressive Montenegrins would somehow bring NATO into a war that maybe Washington didn't want. I don't think of Montenegro as especially aggressive. I think you're very tall. I mean, you're remarkably tall, and you're a very handsome people, but aggressive, I'm not so sure. Anyway, we have with us a wonderful panel to help discuss this, and I will do a little brief introductions and sort of call them up. But first, I do want to thank Minister Darmanovic for a very good and thoughtful introduction to this text. So first, if I can bring up David Konecki. He is the political director, which is the top civil servant of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. He has a long career with European, Euro-Atlantic, NATO affairs. He was head of the political section of the Czech NATO delegation in Brussels, and I think he will have lots of interesting things to say. Then Bruno Lette, who's with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Bruno studies geopolitics. He's worked on EU common security and defense policy, and is one of the people we go to find good interlocutors on these topics. Ambassador Stefano Stefanini from Italy. Stefano is an old friend dating from Moscow days when I was a journalist and he was a political officer. He was a great swimmer, which he still is, but he also was ambassador of Italy to NATO. He was diplomatic advisor to the president of Italy. He's been in Washington, in New York, and still is in Brussels thinking about NATO issues and advising people. And last, Judy Ansley, please, who is part of the Atlantic Council, joined the Future Europe Initiative, but had worked on the National Security Council, was Deputy National Security Advisor, and worked on the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. I think what we really have is quite an extraordinary group of people here, and I'm very pleased to have them. So the first thing I'm going to do, yes? Robert, forgive me. Oh, that's terrible, because I'm working from the organizer's list, which is terrible. Robert Shechel, NATO, Poland. Robert, come on up. My apologies, truly. Has been working with NATO for years, and is someone I've actually interviewed on questions of NATO capabilities. So he's the ghost in the machine. The first question I just want to ask everyone, rather than go and have everyone talk at great length, given the title, put to the test, what would you all say is the biggest test, the biggest risk that this alliance faces now? Why don't you begin, David? We'll just go down. Give me a brief response.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the invitation. And it's my first time here, and I'm to the conference and to the Montenegro, and I share your sentiment that it's really remarkable here. On to your question, if I should rephrase it a bit, what would be my main priorities which the NATO should achieve to remain relevant, which is, rephrasing your question on the challenges, I would see three things, and many of them have been already mentioned here. The first thing is keeping shared strategic vision. It has been said that, the world is changing, geopolitics is back, spheres of influence are back. China is rising to one of the strategic posts in the international arena. Arms control regimes are crumbling. In this situation, the NATO really needs to keep shared vision. That's first. What's the world around? How we see the world as the allies. But the most importantly, that's connected to it. What's the NATO place in such a world?
That's the risk, that we won't share a particular vision.
And even if we share the vision, we might not share
what to do
about it through NATO. Right. So that's basically the double challenge.
Okay. Bruno, what about you?
Well,
try to speak into the microphone.
Yeah. So
Thanks.
if it is to address the vulnerabilities of NATO, let me perhaps piggyback a little bit on a famous book that was written by the US political scientist Steve Waltz. He actually studied why throughout history alliances endure or collapse. And he identified three reasons why alliances actually collapse. The first one is basically the failure to adapt to the nature of the threat. Second one is basically alliance members no longer being willing to do what they have to do to contribute to the alliance. And the third reason is the leading power no longer being willing or no longer being able to lead. So those are usually the three reasons throughout history why alliances have collapsed. Now, if we look at these three risk categories, we can see that NATO faces risk in all three categories today. Now, I also have to say, though, that the Alliance has done a wonderful job in the past years to address these vulnerabilities, especially looking at the 2014 and 2016 Wales and Warsaw summits, where it really tried to address these categories. But looking ahead, let's not take it for granted and keep working on all three categories.
Well, I mean, let me just press you. Of those three problems, which do you think right now is the most dangerous or pressing, Bruno? Bruno first.
I think it's an issue of leadership inside the alliance.
Thank you. Okay. Stefano.
Steve, first, thank you very much for your word, and thank to the forum for inviting me. I'll try to answer your first question, taking a sort of bit look a little bit more from a distance. The main threat.
So just bring it. Yeah.
The main threat. Okay. The main threat to transatlantic relations at the moment, I think, is the lack of unity among its members, or rather, the conviction by many of its members that they're better off facing challenges like China or even like climate change by themselves than united. Obviously, and you said something, the Trump administration attitude toward Europe is a case in point. But I'm European, so let me look at it from a European. It's all too easy for a European to put the blame on America. So let's look from a European point of view.
It's traditional.
You have Brexit. You have the differences among members of the EU that have been brought to the fore by the recent elections, including, and before I mentioned China before. We're divided on how to deal with China. My own country being an example of going alone in dealing with the Belt and Road Initiative. And these, obviously, NATO has shown an incredible resilience, possibly some help from Moscow, in remaining united. But the general atmospherics at the moment are working again, unfortunately. And I'm Atlanticist to the core, are working against the transatlantic relations, unless we do something about it.
Okay. We'll come back to these trends. I think it's very important.
Yeah,
Judy.
Okay. A little bit difficult being towards the end of a panel because a lot of things have already been said, but if I were to look at just one threat that I think is the biggest challenge to NATO at the moment, it was referred to on the earlier panel, the return of great power competition, and particularly the Russian activities within the European theater. I don't discount what you're saying about some of the more out-of-area issues, but if we just look around, particularly in the Balkans area, their activities with the alleged activities of the coup and attempted coup in Montenegro, interference with in Macedonia during the referendum over the Prespa agreement, activities really throughout Europe go to Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, Georgia. We see Russia a bit on the move in ways that, are not the traditional ways 70 years ago when the alliance was formed, but in ways that nonetheless are very damaging. Now, I think NATO has done a very good way and a very good job in adapting to these new threats, adapting by having troops deployed closer to the border, the eastern border with Russia, and in the cyber area. But I think it's something we have to be very vigilant about. I think complacency could be a real problem. Is Russia doing enough for NATO to react in certain activities? So we have to be aware of that, and I think it has to be something we're all mindful of.
Okay. Robert.
Thank you.
What worries you?
What worries NATO?
Yeah.
Everything and nothing in a way, because, to slightly provocative question to a NATO official, what are the NATO vulnerabilities? But, that's your specialty, Steve. I would try to basically, follow what Bruno said. If you look at actually the picture, the answer to the question from my side would be that perhaps one thing we should be particularly thoughtful about is actually the fact that we sometimes forget about what we are and what capability we represent. NATO, that's 1 billion people. That's half of the economic and the military potential of planet Earth. That's not bad, for starters, right? But to use Bruno's 3 categories, if you like, the challenges, vulnerabilities. The first one is NATO needs to adapt, and is it? Well, we are. If we weren't, we would not have such a comprehensive cyber policy right now. Let me remind you, Brussels summit last year, cyber attack could potentially trigger Article 5. And it's not just verbal stuff, it's about capacities that we have and we are finessing every day, either on our own. We have the cyber center in Mons. We are cooperating on a daily basis, 24 hours, 7 days a week with the European Union, sharing data. Second, the question of what we're doing something. Well, right now, as we debate those issues, there is 2,500 military from Germany, in Germany, but I'm not sure, I think they're not just German ones, who are congregating in one place with over 900 vehicles, and they are going to move to Żagań in Poland, where the Noble Jump, sorry for the jargon, very high readiness joint task force, meaning NATO Spear, will be practicing. Now, that is a daily activity. And that's just one. No time, but I could give a long list. And the third issue, well, let me address it head on. I'm not going to get involved into some sort of evaluation stuff concerning this and that, the pronouncement of different NATO leaders. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to look at the reality of the US engagement in NATO and the US contribution, well, it is as strong as it has ever been, whether you look from the point of view of the resources, the military commitment, the political initiative. So, you know what? Bottom line is, let's look at the whole forest and not just some trees. And as has been said, I think also you and Minister Manovic, NATO has faced a lot of challenges and crises, and we always came out strong.
No, it's true. And I also think if you look at the American Congress, I mean, it's completely in support of NATO, 98-0 in the Senate. I once asked Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the House, whether she thought it was a good idea to have legislation in America now that would require a 2/3 vote of the Senate to leave NATO, since it required a 2/3 vote of the Senate to join NATO, and she dismissed this. She said, it'll never come to that. So, post mortem, let's see. So, one of the old questions I always had about NATO was, if NATO was the answer, what is the question? And in the Cold War days, that was pretty clear. In the post-Cold War days, it got fuzzy because NATO still had this notion that it would somehow pull Russia into at least some kind of joint understanding of what security meant, and we could work together on terrorism and climate and blah, blah, blah. And clearly in Putin's second term, that hasn't really happened. And in Crimea, suddenly there was an answer again, the same old answer, which was Russia. But the question I have is twofold. If that's true, is NATO actually responding in the most modern, thoughtful way to a new kind of Russian threat, or is it reverting to the old style, first of all? And second of all, does everyone share that same sense of threat? I don't think the Germans do, for instance, or the French. I mean, certainly in Central Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, people may feel it, but it is not a feeling that is fully shared, in my opinion. So I'm just curious, what do you think as a Czech? You're right in the middle of it. You've got a lot of Russian investment. I mean, you have good, decent relations with Moscow. I mean, what is it that Russia, you think, is after? I mean, these are vulnerabilities it's exploiting that clearly are already there. It's not creating them.
Yeah. Well, the first question was whether the NATO reacts in the modern way to Russian threat, and my answer would be clear yes. I think the answer of the NATO is appropriate. On the other hand, it keeps the door open. It has the potential to de-escalate. So I think it's a very good historic notion of the NATO dual-track approach to the most important challenges, basically, reacting in a robust way, but also keeping doors open for the de-escalation and basically coming back to the previous non-confrontational stance. That's first. Second, from the Czech Republic point of view, I have to say that we have very comfortable strategic security situation. We are surrounded by the allies, we are members of the NATO, we are members of the EU. Our security policy is and must be done in the multilateral formats, which we are members now. So if you would think about it from the strategic point of view, that's the maximum what we could achieve. And then, of course, the question is, and I think that's the question for each and every country, and that leads to this, threat perception. What is the level of the threat perception in Europe? The most important, and we experienced that once we entered NATO, and I think the Montenegro also experiences this as the new NATO member states, or quite freshly, that entering organizations like NATO or EU is not the end of the story. It's basically the only beginning. You have to then define, what's your interest, how you achieve it, and what's also your ability to join the consensus on certain things, and also to invest in the things which you might not perceive as they are directly relating to you, but are directly relating to the organization which is important to you. And that would be basically my answer on the threat. The biggest strength of the NATO is that we are able to decide, and then we are able to create common responses. And it was said already, the NATO must work for each and every member state in terms of perceptions. There might be different perceptions based on geopolitics in Spain vis-a-vis Russia, and they might perceive Africa in a different way. But at the end of the day, the NATO must work for everybody. And in terms of Russia, I think it does.
Okay. Would anyone else want to jump in on this? I mean, what is the Russia issue really? I mean, are we thinking of Russia in the way it is now, or are we still reverting to old ideas of certain kinds of deterrence? For instance, the Brits are in a big fight with NATO, actually, because NATO wants Britain to have more territorial forces and more tanks and so on, and the Brits don't really want to do it. They say, actually, the Germans should be doing that, as the Germans used to do. But again, this is, in a way, a very old-fashioned notion of what deterring Russia's about. Would anyone want to jump in on this?
No,
Stefano.
I would jump in just for a point. First of all, to confirm what you said about the perception of the Russian threat is very different across NATO. But if you take Italy, that's probably one of the countries that mostly discounts Russia as an active threat. Every NATO ally accepts the fact that since there are some or a number of allies that feel that threat, they are prepared to give the reassurance with the participation to the forward presence and creating that's required. I was recently in Riga, and I was told how important it was for Latvia to have troops of different nationality, including Italian, serving there. The question is whether or not this new kind of threats, which are not military in nature, that we all feel on our skin, especially in this part of the world, whether or not it's NATO that, and NATO's done a lot of work to raise to other challenges like cyber, where it's up to NATO to confront them, or we have to find other solutions. Obviously, cooperation between NATO and EU being a case in point. Let's not forget that the strongest reaction to the 2014 events in Ukraine, as the annexation of Crimea and the rebellion in Donbass, has been from Europe the EU sanctions.
Right. Judy, did you want to come in?
Just to follow up on what you said, I think my view is that most of the nations in NATO do see Russia as a threat. I think you're right. The degree to that might be different depending on geography, although when I think of my country, we're the farthest away, and I think there is, there aren't too many things in the United States that there's bipartisan support on right now, but the Russian threat, there is definitely bipartisan support. And that's coming from the administration and from Capitol Hill as well. So I think we take that threat very seriously. You raised the possibility of maybe some other organization should deal with threats posed by Russia because they're not the traditional military threats, more the hybrid that we're seeing now. But I think NATO has done a very good job in adapting, particularly in the cyber realm. And I think that we have a community of nations, shared values. For the most part, I think a shared perception of the threat that has the capabilities to respond to the new threats that we're seeing. And I would just advocate for a lot of the things that our colleague from NATO has been talking about, that NATO is the right organization to deal with these threats that we're seeing. And I would hate to get into trying to find some other way of dealing with it. Within the militaries, I think of all of our countries, we are developing capabilities to deal with these hybrid threats. And so, yeah.
Would you include interference in the elections?
I would. I think there are interference in elections. I think that there are other parts of government you might want to pull in, but maybe intelligence communities, for instance. But again, NATO has access to all of that as well. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, part of the question is it the right instrument for everything? And that's a legitimate question.
I think it is legitimate. I just think that as long as it's doing a good job. But I'd love to hear from our NATO colleague on that.
Well, I would say that in certain respects, I mean, the age of illusion is over. I mean, and that goes across the whole NATO community. I mean, it's part of your earlier question. I mean, are there different sort of degrees of idealism or hopefulness? Of course they are, and that's nothing strange about this. I would be surprised if there were exactly the same type of sort of sensitivities, in countries which have more direct historical experience of and adjacent and all the rest of it. But the point of the matter is that we have responded in a variety of ways. We have a policy which is agreed by everybody. So in other words, in NATO always look not so much what is the starting point. The starting point is nations come to the table with slightly different views. But I have to say, thanks to the Russians' actions, we have a policy. It's defense, deterrence, and dialogue as well. For some countries, one part is slightly more important than others, but we're doing this all. The enhanced forward presence, this is the majority of NATO countries. It's not just a couple of countries who send their soldiers. We also look after the South as well. We have no luxury. We have to do it all at the same time. And the situational awareness of what Russia is doing is much, much greater today. One small example in answer to the other question about the other organization. Next week I'm going to Helsinki. And the reason is because there is an event on hybrid threats organized by the European Union Center of Excellence on this. And we work together. And all the strands from classical military intelligence, but also cyber, corruption, disinformation, they are looked together, not just by NATO, but European Union. And, we know the challenges are, but we are responding in a way which is a result of the collective wisdom of the alliance, which is calibrated, which is not provocative. We do it in a very transparent way, but we hope also that our message, Russia, is very clear. We know what you're doing.
I understand.
We are doing what we have to do.
Sure. I'm just trying to make a distinction. Maybe it's just a journalistic distinction between what Russia threatens and the way it manipulates NATO countries' vulnerabilities, which are real. I mean, that's why social media works, right? It's not because Russia invents the problems that it exacerbates. So, I mean, that's maybe a hard question. Is NATO the right instrument? I'm not really sure. But one thing that intrigues me, which does seem to be a real strain right now, is Turkey. And I'm curious if people want to talk a bit about Turkey. Turkey keeps saying it's about to buy S-400 anti-missile systems from Russia. Erdogan is clearly annoyed with Trump. They get on to some degree, and then to some degree they don't. Turkey's a NATO member, but NATO's never been very good at, I think, using Article 2 of the Atlantic Charter. I get confused. But that's the one about shared values and democracy. NATO's never wanted to deal with that very, very much, no matter what its members do. And maybe that's a problem. So I'm just curious, whether you regard this threat from Turkey as real. It could be a serious defense threat if they put in anti-missile systems that can defeat the F-35s. But is it a bigger problem? Are we losing the southern flank? Bruno, do you have a thought, or anyone?
Let me perhaps answer your question a little bit in a different way.
Please.
Because I know that when we talk about NATO, it often leads to Russia conversations and Turkey conversations. So perhaps I would like to zoom out a little bit, 10,000 feet.
Okay.
And that's what think tankers
Well,
do.
maybe 8,000 feet.
But I think what we're really facing here in the bigger picture is NATO that must think of a new world order. Things are changing. And when we talk, Russia is one element of the equation. Turkey is another. But there's a bigger equation here that we must consider, I think. We're living in changing geopolitics. The problem, however, is that it's a bit hard to understand where we're at because the new thing hasn't come yet. Actually, the times that we're living in, I believe, could be best described as the end of a status quo, but we do not know yet what is coming next, and that makes it harder. Now, Turkey, of course, has its own doubts and concerns. We talk a lot about Russia. Actually, I agree with Robert's initial comments that NATO is not doing that bad addressing the Russia challenge in traditional geographies. Look at the Baltics and in the Black Sea there, I think NATO has done a wonderful job. But we ought to start thinking also about new domains where Russia is challenging. Think the Arctic. Think old Cold War concepts like the GUIC gap that are coming back. The GUIC gap, for instance, is the Atlantic maritime space between Greenland, the UK, and Ireland. Russia's efforts in electronic warfare. So these are new challenges that Russia is bringing, but we keep, in my opinion, we keep thinking about these traditional geographies. Start thinking about new domains. China. I'm always remarkably surprised, actually, how little thinking there is about China inside NATO. There is some thinking, but not as much as I think we should. China is, in my opinion, an unavoidable factor in European security 10 years from now. In my opinion, it will be. Already it is here, perhaps mainly in economic sense, but already the Chinese presence could pose some challenges to NATO in terms of critical infrastructure, the way they, for instance, control seaports or airports. Take, for instance, a situation where NATO would have to ship military equipment to a conflict zone using a European seaport that is in the hands of China. What does NATO do? Are we calling Beijing for permission? These are questions that we need to think of.
China's on my list, but you've gotten to it.
Well,
No.
I know I jumped from China.
No, because
to Turkey,
one of the big questions, people used to talk about Russia as joining NATO, and then I thought, oh God, we'll have a collective defense alliance against China, which is quite a thought. But the point you're making is real. There has been a kind of prise de conscience, a kind of sudden consciousness that the China Bill Clinton thought was going to happen isn't happening, or the China Zelek thought was happening isn't going to happen. Of course, we risk making monsters. We're quite good at sort of over-exaggerating enemies, because it's always helpful to have an enemy. I once remembered, even a long time ago, writing about the Republicans looking for an enemy and finding China. Now everybody seems to have found them. But your point is well taken about China and its hold on European infrastructure, put it that way, and its effort, and here we get into the EU, to hit vulnerabilities there with 16+1 and different kinds of loans. Anyone want to jump in, but Turkey, China, are these the new 8,000-foot risks that NATO should really be spending more time thinking about?
Yeah, if I can briefly come back to Turkey, because this is one of the things. If you speak about the strategies, how to deal, or which instruments to use, which could be used, then Turkey is the perfect example. I have to be fair at the beginning that, to my knowledge, Turkey is not stumbling block to anything what's going on in NATO. They basically were supportive in all of the policies which we, as the Czech Republic, deemed important. So that's one disclaimer. Second, of course, we are paying close attention what's happening in Turkey, but there is perfect process how to address any concerns, and that's the EU enlargement process. The point is that through this process, Turkey itself committed to fulfill the high standards in democracy, rule of law, human rights, whatever you have. There is an intrusive screening process, and there is process which should address all the gaps, concerns, however you would call it. Are we using this process?
Yeah,
Well, that's the strategic question. So if somebody is posing the question about the concerns, what's happening in Turkey, there is perfect instrument on the table which Turkey itself committed to.
Yes.
And that's why we are, time supporters to use this instrument.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Judy?
Yeah, on the issue of Turkey, and I agree with my colleague on the sort of the democracy side of it. There are things out there that can be done, but I would also point out that Turkey does have elections. Yes, they have some problems, but there are other countries within Europe, within NATO, within the EU, where I would say there are at least similar, if not even greater concerns on democracy.
You can even name them if you want.
No, I think I will take a pass on that, but but I think we all know who they are. But that's not my big concern with Turkey when it comes to NATO. The big concern is really, if they go through with it, the purchase of Russian equipment. I mean, we have had NATO allies who have had Soviet equipment, Russian equipment, but it's an inheritance from the past, and and the job is to get rid of it and secure weapons from the West. This may be the first time. I'm not sure if it is, but it may be the first time, certainly, that such a sophisticated Soviet system would be purchased by a NATO ally. I mean, obviously, for the United States, it's going to be a big concern, and I doubt very much we'd be able to go through with the sale of the F-35, which would be a major issue between two NATO allies if it came to that. So I do worry about that, and I don't know how NATO has reacted to that as an alliance yet. It hasn't happened. But I think that's going to be something that NATO is going to have to take on. Yeah. How are we going to react to allied nations buying weaponry from, an adversary, potential adversary?
Because, I mean,
So
it's a
that's
bit
gonna be
like the whole Huawei problem, which we don't have to get into here.
Right.
But I mean, it's kind of a similar issue.
Yeah, it will be, yeah. And I think just if I could, just for a minute on the issue of China, completely agree that China is a threat that we have to focus on. And the latest national security strategy put out by the Trump administration, the focus was shifted to great power conflicts, Russia and China. So that's something from our country's point of view we're certainly looking at, and I think it's something that NATO has I'm sure started looking at, but I think you raised some good issues about, do we get into a port if there's a crisis? And those are things that probably need a little bit more work. I'm not as concerned about Chinese investment in Europe. I think it's a potential problem. Economic development is great. You have to make sure there are no strings attached to the investments that happen. So I think it's something we have to be mindful of. And I think the fact that we're talking about it, we are mindful of it.
Yes, that's right.
But I think it is something to be watched. Thank you.
Stefano?
Well, Turkey certainly has no problem with elections. If any, one too many. One too many elections. But the S-400 issue is actually becoming a S-400 versus F-35, which means a major bilateral issue between the US and Turkey. There is a real concern, for instance, in the Turkish industry that was gearing up to participate in the F-35 program if they lose this. So that can really, the S-400 issue can become a train wreck, because NATO, with all the tolerance that it can show toward deviation, and there have been deviation in the past, will not be able to ignore an industrial military dispute between the US and Turkey. As simple as that.
No, this is
Even if NATO has no procedure like the EU has toward members that are in default. Regarding China, just let me say one thing. I was recently in Washington in an Aspen conference, and I was on the Chatham House, so I cannot say the names, but I heard two people who were prominent, both of them, in the National Security Council in past administration, one a Republican, one a Democrat, saying exactly the same words. If we lose Europe, meaning if we're not able to cooperate with Europe, was not an accusation to Europe, was more a self-criticism. If we lose Europe, we, the US, are going to lose the 5G competition. So the problem with China is what I referred at the beginning, is not confronting the challenge with China together.
okay. Robert, did you want to come in? Okay. Well, let's segue to another issue I think matters, and then also I want you in the audience to think of questions that you might want to ask. I'd love to bring you in soon. But the next thing that interests me, because it's really EU-American relations, right? We call them Euro-Atlantic relations. We can call them whatever we like. Slightly different from transatlantic, right? The EU, I think, quite reasonably and rationally has listened to American pleas, which have been long-standing, to take a bigger role in security and defense policy. It has trouble doing that, but it's listening. And as soon as it actually starts to do something, the Americans get all upset and say, no, that's not what we meant at all. That's not what we meant. That's protectionism, right? So this is inevitably, given we're talking about security and NATO and the EU, and almost, most EU members are members of NATO also. So, what's going on there? I mean, is this, the EU army seems to me madness, because first of all, you'd need a command structure. And to have a command structure, you need a political structure that could act very quickly, because people in the military tend to follow orders rather than invent things as they go along. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is this a good thing that's happening? Is it a bad thing? Does it need to be managed better than it's being managed? Judy, please.
As the only American on the panel, did you want me to take the first shot at that?
Well,
one?
sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think, let me go back to maybe the premise of your question. When the United States wants Europe to do more, we want our European allies in NATO to be doing more, so we're not necessarily saying spend more on a European army. However, I think that, quite frankly, the Secretary General had it right, and the Foreign Minister mentioned this in his opening remarks. I think that from a U.S. point of view, from probably a NATO point of view as well, whatever our allies do to increase their defense capabilities is a win for NATO. It makes our allies stronger, it contributes more to the common defense, and that's a good thing. Now, obviously, we don't want anything that would conflict with NATO, we don't want anything that would take resources away. But I have to believe there's a way to manage that. I think the main focus from a U.S. point of view is we can get Europeans to be spending more, we're spending more in defense, that all goes to the common good.
Stefano?
Let me say, the message from Washington has changed significantly, not on substance, but on how to get there. A few years ago, during the Obama administration, we were told it does not matter how you do it, as long as you do it. Do it NATO, do it EU, do it nationally. You need to do more on defense. Now this has changed. With regard to the European army, I really think it's a big distraction. And my reservation are of two nature. One is substantial. It would have an added value only if it meant additional capacity. Not if we just turn a number of people in uniform under Czech, Italian, French uniform in a European uniform. So it would have to be additional. But then if you have, say, a European army, which, sorry, European command, etc., how deployable is it, considering that some European countries have been extremely reluctant about deployability? And I mean Germany, but for excellent German reason. So, but I have a more sort of profound reservation about European army, which is I'm not sure how many of the people who have been proposing it have actually served in the military.
Yes.
If they
There's
have,
that problem. Yeah.
and I have, you'd know that you serve, there has to be an emotional connecting link with your flag, with your nation. Europe is not there yet. I don't know if, maybe it will get there, but it is not there yet. And this is the condition why you can ask the ultimate sacrifice. NATO, which is an outstanding military alliance, does not have a NATO army. So this is the absurdity. The EU, which has not defense and security in its DNA, not yet at least, and in the Treaty of Lisbon there is very little compared to Article 5, one sort of jump to a next level of having a European army. This is why I really think, and I am extremist on this, that the phrase European army should be banned. It's one of those phrases that should be banned, like another one is Marshall Plan, because the Marshall Plan, there was once, worked fine. Every time we've been talking about Marshall Plan for something else, has been a failure.
Well, let's ban it after this panel's over, but not before. Bruno, and then David.
No, a quick reaction on that. I mean, I'm based in Brussels, and strategic autonomy, I mean, you hear that every day, basically, strategic autonomy. But I'm not a big fan of how this discourse is being led. I mean, I agree with you that, you know, we need to keep it real. I think perhaps autonomy is a poor choice of vocabulary. I think perhaps we should have thought of something more like strategic synergy. Because strategic autonomy in Europe cannot come at the cost of transatlantic cooperation. Strategic autonomy, I think, is a really Brussels technical project to enhance concrete cooperation, not to create a new army. And this is what we need to understand. It's not about a new army, it's just technical cooperation. So we need to think about that. But, you know, I think the whole confusion is also due to the following. I think Europeans are still in doubt about what is the best security model for themselves. I mean, we see three avenues here, three avenues of thinking. It's either, you know, full reliance on EU for our security, either it's full reliance on NATO for our security, or it's some sort of task division between EU and NATO, which is now pretty hip to talk about as well. But still, Europeans are not aligned in which model fits the best for our future security, and there we need to be more decisive. There's still, you know, countries that think differently than other countries. So this is what we need to figure out for ourselves. Which model do we choose for? And if we choose it for, let's go for it.
David, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly on the European army. First, my reaction would be: is there NATO army? You know, that's first, and that's how it goes. If you would speak about the European army, by the way, there is no debate about it in the EU. Zero, full stop. What's happening there it's quite a strong debate about security and defense, but this debate is framed in something which I would call stronger Europe. And it's not only the security and defense aspects, but there are some other aspects, and this is what we insist on. And for us, the other aspects also are the strong transatlantic link, because the strong and functioning transatlantic link would basically make EU stronger, European Union, Europe stronger. And that's why, you know, I think it must be there, and it's beyond NATO. It's not only NATO. NATO is also part, but it's not only NATO. The second thing is 22 member states, or 22 states, are members both of the NATO, of the EU. We are there, and these states, I am quite sure, will make sure that they will not be forced to do one thing for the one organization and the second for the other organization. So that's the other part. And the third thing is, if you really would think of having European army in kind of troops under certain command, you can do it right now.
Yeah.
You can take the command structure of the France, Germany, probably UK. You can bring the soldiers from different European countries, and that's the European army. You can do it right now.
Well, in a way, that's what finally happened with Libya, which is they used
Correct.
NATO to basically pursue a non-NATO war, but they used the structures and the command structure of NATO and to try to make Libya happen.
But
That's interesting.
But let me add one thing which is important in all of these security and defense efforts in EU. They are made possible thanks to NATO.
Yeah.
The thing that we are able to cooperate as the European is that through NATO, we are on the same standards, the same training, the same procedures, and all of these things. So it's basically mutually reinforcing. And so far, I have not seen the situation where we would basically face any tension, and we would have to decide. The issue with the US and the reaction of the US is this. If you look very attentively into it, it's industrial matter. It's not about how the things will be developed, for what they will be developed. It's simply about the industry, whether the industry of the US has the access to this kind of programs in Europe, which is not strategic question.
No. It's to some degree a protectionist question. That's right. Robert, did you want to come in? I think you did.
Very briefly, because many things have been said, but not by me. So, you know, I mean, I agree very much that we should really separate. There's some issues related in the just, you know, normal defense industry issues. That's nothing new. I mean, countries, of course, like to promote that stuff. But again, same appeal I made earlier. We should really look at the bigger picture, big picture. The big picture is pretty good. I mean, it's not just the issue of, you know, this question, although it's important. Additional money allocated, not just by individual countries, but for the PESCO. That is, of course, good news. And we as NATO will welcome that. We do have certain issues that are important to us as NATO, looking after the interests of all 29 and all, which is we don't want to have excessive amount of duplication, because some is obviously, you know, inevitable, but, you know, shape is shape. There's no point to invent another one. We are extremely strong on emphasizing the issue of inclusivity. We want to ensure that whatever happens, that those members, apart from the 22 you mentioned who are members of NATO, not members of the EU, and vice versa, they can participate. That's important to everybody. But if you look at some specific issues, let me just name one, which is military mobility. This is not a hypothetical issue. This is not a slogan. We need, as NATO, European Union, because of a variety of ways. You know, times have changed. These days, if you want to know forces, there are various, you know, laws in place. Which European Union, sometimes European Commission is actually the main stakeholder. What about investment in certain standards, the ability of bridges to hold heavy equipment, and so on? And we are working together. And EU is really, if you like, helping NATO and NATO. And in terms of the terms, my favorite term would be strategic co-responsibility. And I think we actually are applying this, because by simply the things that we do together, and they go beyond those that already been mentioned. We could even talk about synergies when it comes to policy towards the Western Balkans.
Right.
We are different animals, but we have the same agenda. And for daily work, sometimes not very in the limelight, but still important. We are actually fulfilling the agenda which has the same goals: stability, transparency, and best life for everybody concerned. We don't have a hidden agenda like the EU. So
Thanks.
neither NATO nor EU has a hidden agenda. We have the same, even though we're very different.
I must say, as an American, I do worry about the American drift away from, Congress is there's no question, but Steve Walt's been mentioned once already. But I mean, there is a question about whether this American generation, it started with Obama, who had no European roots, so to speak, who don't remember World War II, who Trump says, they're not paying their share, they need to take care of themselves, they're more Europeans than Americans, they're richer than we are, they should do more. I mean, I think this matters, and in the sort of longer run, I think it's another vulnerability, not for today, but it does actually worry me. I would love to get some questions. Given the lights, it's really hard to see. So if someone could stand, I see Mike Holtzel there. I don't know if we have mics. If not, just stand up and, yes, we apparently do have microphones. Thank you. I just
Shout.
It's always like this. It's never on, right?
Outstanding session so far. Thank you very much. My name is Mike Holtzel. I'm from Johns Hopkins SAIS in DC. I'd like to go back to the very important question that you brought up, Steve, about the values component to NATO. That NATO is not just a military alliance, it's a political alliance of shared values. You made the point, I think it was a valid one, that the alliance has not always lived up to its principles, but I would like to say that more often than not it has. I mean, we had no trouble accepting Salazar's Portugal. Nonetheless, when the Greek colonels took over in '67 for 6 years, they were frozen out of sensitive information at NATO. The same thing happened, incidentally, for a few weeks in the summer of 1975 when it looked like the Portuguese communists were going to take over. And as Judy will remember, in the first tranche of NATO enlargement after the Cold War, we made sure that there was a political component to qualifications. Robert will know that, I remember distinctly going to Poland 2 weeks after civilian control of the military was instituted. That wasn't until March of 1997. So there is a component. Now, what is that? One would hope it's democracy. And Stefano and Judy talked about the threat right now. I'm really concerned about this because of the Russians, basically. We know that they were deeply involved in the 2016 election. We know that at least our 17 intelligence agencies assure us that they're still involved, that we know about it. Robert said that a cyber attack would trigger Article 5. Well, you mean a cyber attack on what? On the military, on physical infrastructure? I would submit that, that a cyber attack on our democracy strikes right at the heart of things. So, does NATO have a role? It's certainly not the only institution that should have a role, but shouldn't we really get NATO to cooperate with the civilian authorities, assuming that they care about it? I'll leave that to a future discussion. It seems to me we are facing a real crisis of hollowing out the reason for the alliance.
Great, thank you. Are there other, I see a question way in the back. I know it's hard to run around. Oh, there's a second microphone. Great, thank you. So the gentleman in the back. And if you could also tell us who you are.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission of the Republic of Turkey, the embassy in Podgorica. I would like to say that concerning the S-400, as it was one of the discussion issues. Well, Turkey right now has not a very highly effective air defense system. Since 10 years, we are trying to make this umbrella on Turkey, to put this umbrella on Turkey, this air defense system. And since 10 years ago, we asked our ally USA to sell this equipment to us. Since 10 years, we couldn't buy it. So we had to somehow solve this situation. And concerning S-400, as some of the esteemed your colleagues mentioned, there are some, S-300 systems in which countries, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and also Greece. Slovakia and Bulgaria, they were not former allies, but in Greece.
Right. No, I realize that you want to make a point, and you have the right to do it, but I would just ask you to be a bit briefer.
Okay.
I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, okay.
Please.
In 2 minutes, I will end. Yeah. For example, these allies now use S-300 systems. Okay, what is the point? It can affect F-35s. This is the situation. Now, on Syria, F-35 of Norway, USA, and Israel are flying, and the S-400, which are administered by the Russians in Syria, is not affecting F-435. Norway is flying at its borders to Russia, and the Russian S-400 is not affecting this system.
Okay.
Our system will be in our hands, Turkish personnel, not Russians, and it's a defense system, it's not an attack system.
Can I just ask you, is it a done deal yet or not?
What do you mean?
Is the S-400 coming to Turkey yet or not, or is it still up in the air, so to speak?
It is coming, of course.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your intervention and
the Secretary General of NATO didn't mention any negative things until now. Who is the first responsible person? He didn't mention anything regarding S-400. He said Turkey is a sovereign country, can have, any system.
Okay, thank you, sir. Is there another question before we go back to the panel? Oh, okay. Who would like to answer either question? Mike, Bruno, please.
Quick reaction on both questions. First of all, in terms of value, very important, I would say, to embrace them. NATO is about solidarity, not selfishness. NATO should be about collective interest, not national interest. However, of course, we see that, for instance, the questions that is being asked regularly in Brussels, how can you combine an America First policy with collective interests? It's a fair question. I'm not judging on this question, but it is being raised. So this is something that we must think about, because if these values disappear, the unconditional nature of Article 5 will erode, and Article 5 will become a matter of pragmatism. That's not what we want. Also, a short reaction on the Turkish plans, which I do not want to judge about, but I would like perhaps to hear from our Turkish colleague how they think the S-400 system will bring strategic military value to the security of your country. Because as far as I understand it, these S-400s will function as standalone systems, basically meaning that NATO will not allow them to be plugged into wider C4 capabilities. And, so I just would like to hear how you think that a
maybe over lunch
system can bring
not now.
security.
Okay. Does anyone else want to respond? Yes. Stefan, go ahead.
Quickly to both. Michael, you're perfectly right. You must be familiar with a study, NATO 70, which has been published, presented at the Munich Security Conference, that actually brings up the issue about NATO allies who might be backsliding on democracy. I participated in some discussion about it, and that was one of the most controversial points. I think the conclusion of the study is exactly where we as far as we can go now. At least the issue should be on the table. Regarding the S-400 and Turkey, I'd only like to say that I'm familiar with that statement by the Secretary General. What I'm saying is simply that since the United States does not seem to accept that the S-400 can be separated from the rest, and the United States will have a bilateral issue with Turkey which affects the sales of F-35, at that point it will become very difficult for any NATO Secretary General to ignore it. So I'm not entering in the merits, but simply on what I think is going to happen.
Judy, go ahead.
I know time is short, but I just wanted to quickly comment on both of these issues. On the issue of Turkey and the S-400, I am not a military expert. I don't know the technical details, but certainly our military is very concerned about what would happen if an F-35 was stationed near an S-400. So those are technical issues. They have to be worked out, and it's a bilateral issue. So I agree with my colleague Stefano on that one. I don't know the NATO implications. NATO will have to figure that out. Our colleague has mentioned interconnectivity. It just will not be hooked up with the rest of an air defense system in NATO. So those are issues that need to be discussed. But again, those are technical. In terms of American values, I sometimes think that this the America First policy is a little bit overblown in terms of the way we react here and we react with NATO. I mean, in my view, it is America First to be strongly supportive of NATO, because NATO is clearly in the U.S. interest. That would be the way I would interpret that. And I don't think there's any question about U.S. commitment to the alliance, U.S. commitment to Article 5. So I would hope that people don't leave this with a concern about that. I know there's a lot of rhetoric. There's always a lot of rhetoric. And Stephen mentioned earlier about defense spending and NATO should do more, Europeans should do more. President Trump is stating it differently, but he's saying the same thing that all U.S. presidents have said about burden sharing. So I mean, it's style. It may not be helpful in terms of the style, but the message is fairly consistent. So I agree with Michael. I think the values are the bedrock of NATO, and in my view, we still do share those same values.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, I mean, I don't want to, obviously, there's no point for me to repeat the statement. Thank you for bringing up. The Secretary General has spoken a number of times on this issue. First of all, let me state very clearly, Turkey is a very respected ally, and we appreciate the role Turkey is playing. We also fully are cognizant of the security challenges Turkey is facing, both in terms of terrorism, also it's a country bordering a major conflict, and so on. Secretary General has spoken a number of times about this. Being a member of NATO doesn't mean that you lose your prerogatives when it comes to sovereign decisions, but of course the issue of interoperability has also been mentioned a number of times, because that is the issue of great importance for NATO. And of course we hope, we regret any kind of bilateral dispute, so we hope very much that this be resolved. One specific, if I may, because there was a reference to what I said, to be clear, when I refer to what is in the Brussels summit communiqué, is that it's not there will be any automaticity, because Article 5 remains what it is. The important thing is that the cyber attack could be the basis. And in fact, if you look closely, this is even broader now. I was even surprised why the media didn't pick it up that much, because I think it's an important policy and it's an important deterrence statement from NATO as well. The category is actually hybrid. So there's a number, I mean, that's how we adapt as well. It's deterrence, but it's a new kind of deterrence. Secretary General, I think, used the term a few days ago, because that was also, I think, one of the first meetings of this kind. We had national security advisors from all NATO countries coming together to NATO, discussing hybrid issues. It's literally from tweets to tanks. We have to focus on the tanks, but we also have to send the tweets. So, in other words, we are fully cognizant of this continuum, and I take your point. You're perfectly entitled to to say that perhaps we're not doing everything we can, but I can assure you that the allies, and it's not just NATO, civilian military bureaucracy, if you like, but it's the people from all the NATO countries. We share. That's how we work. We analyze the security environment, and we try to respond in a variety of ways. There's no time, but I name about 10, 15 different areas. We are currently, for instance, discussing our space policy and so on. So my message is simple, we are going with the times, and please press us, because that's also how, if you like, we work. But let me at least assure you that NATO is not looking into some past challenges and focusing on them, because that would mean that we're a bit behind the times. We're not. Even if our answers may not be fully satisfactory and certainly not straight away. But 29 countries focusing on something, I think that's already a major step.
I have to say I'm also not very happy that Germany is not buying F-35s when we're talking about connectivity and coherence, but that's a different question too. David, did you want to respond to anything? Okay. One quick question. We've got, I don't know, about 5 minutes left tops, and I don't want to keep people from their lunch, but do any of you think Brexit matters for NATO? That the British leaving the European Union, if they ever do, in fact, will it have an effect on European defense, or will it not? Maybe it'll be beneficial. Anybody have a thought?
Yeah, if
Yes,
I can very briefly, my answer would be, if that happens, no in NATO, yes in the EU.
Right.
Because if you look at the percentage of the defense spending, you are losing quite important country with quite important command and control structure, important military capabilities. All of these things will be out of the reach of the European Union, which, as I said, tries to develop certain capacities in sync with the NATO. So once the UK is out, then the EU will need to find the ways how these capabilities should be basically, or could be basically plugged into the EU operations. And I have to say that UK is quite consistent in saying that they would like to have the closest relationship as possible in this area. So I think the ways could be done. That could be fine.
It depends on, I think it matters. It matters for NATO. On the military side, it depends very much on how it happens. If it happens followed by a EU-UK security agreement, which maintains the existing inclusion of UK in whatever happens to European defense, on the military side, it doesn't matter that much. Politically, it's going to matter because the UK has been traditionally the connecting link between Washington and European allies. A lot of behind-the-scenes diplomacy, and that is an essential connectivity inside NATO. If that link is missing, and obviously, and there are already, other formats that the EU3 are becoming the E3 that could play that role, but it's not like the same thing of having one country, United Kingdom, inside the tent, both in the EU and in NATO.
Very good. I must say, as critical as one could be about NATO, it's worked. I mean, that's simply the case. And the point about deterrence is it deters. And so far, NATO has deterred. And long may it stay that way. I also think we should compliment Jens Stoltenberg, because he's the best Trump handler that I've ever met. and it's really important. So thank you to this wonderful panel. Thank you for your patience, and I guess it's time for lunch. Thanks a lot.